We'd posed a question and we'd asked you all to poll. Could we have the results, please? Could we have the result of the last question? We have an overwhelming majority, 74% people say that maximizing finance for development is all about sectoral reforms, public-private partnerships, raising private capital, and they're all right. So a big round of applause for yourself. We will now be commencing with our plenary sessions, the technical discussions that are supposed to take place today. We seem to have a panel which comprises of all sports people. I don't know what they're doing in a finance seminar. Our moderator is Ms. Yolanda Taylor. She's Practice Manager Solutions and Innovations in Procurement World Bank. She's an active biker. She bikes 20 miles to office every day. And her proud moment in life is that she has co-authored, she's been associated with the World Bank book, which improved access to medicine while the HIV epidemic had broken out in Africa. We have on our panel Mr. Munis Alvi. He's CEO K Electric, and a cricketer, and a thrower by confession. We have with us Mr. Arjuna Herat. He's partner EY Sri Lanka, and he's kindly replaced Mr. Manil Jaisinga, who was our original panelist and who could not join us because of a tragedy in his family. We would really like to thank Mr. Arjuna for taking the time out at such short notice. Next, we have Mr. Irshad Kalimi. He is Deputy Auditor General of Pakistan. He has had the good luck of being associated with 5 to 7 ministries, as I recall, and he's now the Deputy Auditor General of Pakistan. So he's basically seen both sides of the table. We also have with us Mr. we have with us Dr. Kwa. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. He's Director, Capital Management Department, Electricity of Vietnam, and he's a swimmer in his free time. And then last but not least, we have Mr. Muazzam Ahmed. He is Senior Country Officer, International Finance Corporation of Pakistan, and he's a golfer. So we have a full house with all sports people talking about fostering an enabling environment, private sector investments for development. Over to you, Yolanda.
Thank you very much, Hannah. And a very good morning to all the members of this distinguished audience. It is great to be back in South Asia. And back in 2006, 7, 8, I spent a great deal of time working in the South Asia region, and I miss it. So it's really good to be back. In fact, Dr. Shamshad Akhtar was my boss. So that's another fun fact that I worked very closely with her when she was Vice President of the World Bank MENA region in Washington. So I am very pleased, as I said, to be here today with this distinguished panel of experts to discuss how to foster an enabling environment for the public sector to benefit from private sector capabilities, from private sector financing, from the ability of the private sector as far as technical aspects, and how that can support the developing countries' sustainable growth agenda. State-owned enterprises have an important place to roll in economic landscape in many countries, and they are among the largest companies in the world. In fact, in between 9 to 23% of the companies globally are considered SOEs. They generate about $8 trillion US dollars as annual revenues. And they generate as well 5% of total employment and constitute 20% of investments globally. Of course, they have, with such an impressive list of statistics, they have a very significant impact on the economic value added in terms of GDP. As key providers of services and employment across the globe, and particularly in developing countries, inevitably SOEs will be partners in promoting economic growth and the sustainable agenda in developing countries. However, we know that SOEs are not without challenges. We are very aware of that, from bureaucratic inertia to corruption to inefficiencies in service delivery. So to give a sense of the scale of the problem, particularly in terms of corruption, I'm going to cite a survey that was conducted by the OECD earlier this year in 2018. And the survey found out that 42% of the SOEs that were included in the study indicated that at least once they had faced issues with corruption or irregular practices. 42%, that's pretty high. Private sector support and involvement could help improve the efficiency and the profitability of SOEs, amplify their positive service provision role, and drive economic development, whether through privatization or PPPs. However, the governance issues that are facing SOEs is a big deterrent to private sector participation and engagement. The good news, however, is that there are many good governance mechanisms and practices that SOEs can adopt in order to increase their attractiveness to the private sector. From risk management techniques to accurate and transparent financial information, disclosure, and record keeping, to adopting mitigating measures as far as corruption. And that is why we are very fortunate today to have such a distinguished panel of experts that are going to share with us their experiences in the realm of SOEs, spanning Sri Lanka, Vietnam, and Pakistan. They offer a diverse array of perspective on SOEs as partners in maximizing the role of private sector finance in economic development. And before we begin, I'm just going to very quickly give you an idea of the format of the panel. We are going to have two sets of questions. The first question is going to be the same for all members of the panel. And the second set of questions has been particularly crafted to each one of the members of the panels in accordance to their expertise and what they bring to the table. I'm going to ask the panelists to please respond in take up to 3 minutes to respond, because we are now very short of time, and we would like to give a chance at the end to the audience to pose their questions. So let's look at the first question here. The first question is, in your experience, what are the top few challenges, and I would say, we can say 2 or 3 at the most, challenges in attracting and involving private sector as a partner of financing and supporting economic development initiatives in each of the countries that you represent? So let's start with Munir.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It is universally accepted that privatization is a solution to the development across SOEs, as it will get the accountability, the transparency, the human capital development, etc., which is needed to foster the development. In our country, in Pakistan, you can attract investors from across the globe without a problem. We are a growing economy, population is increasing. And I think attracting investors is not the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge is to ensure that you convert your desire to privatize into reality. We have seen in our country a list of companies, state-owned enterprises, which are listed for privatization, but unfortunately those processes are either delayed or shelved altogether. If you go to the private website of the Privatization Commission, you see a list of few companies which are on the top agenda, and then there's another list, but nothing is happening. We have seen road shows of by institutions for selling distribution companies, the power distribution companies, huge amount of capital, time, amounts have spent, but ultimately, nothing has been done. So it is important that you continue with the approach to privatize. If you delay these processes, you will lose the investors who would really make a difference. And they might not be looking at the privatizations seriously, and ultimately you will lose a lot of time in that. So it is important that all the stakeholders should understand the importance of privatization, understand the problems which are there, and they should clearly come up with policies to ensure that it is done with the time frame it is needed. We have seen state-owned enterprises deteriorate because of these delays, and a lot of funding has gone into those to finance the gaps which are created because of inefficiencies. The second important part of the challenge is to provide commitments on which the investors can rely on. We know that the investors take risks that they might not be able to turn around those state-owned enterprises. They would need determined tariffs, for a longer period so that they can plan their investments. They have to be given guarantees where the acquisition of that SOE relates to some part of commitment to be fulfilled by the governments or the regulators or other stakeholders. So they have to be, they have to rely on those commitments. We have seen at times that those commitments were not honored, and because of which a lot of confidence is shattered from the investors. And the last thing I would say on this is that it's very important that we should give protection from the legal system. We have seen in Pakistan entities which are privatized 25 to 30 years ago still are seeing courts looking at those privatization, and a decision against that privatization now, if it's decided by any courts in the country, might jeopardize the entire process. So these would be the three most important parts of us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arjuna.
Right. Great. Thank you. Great to be here in Karachi. I participated in the two previous Fridays, and this is the third Friday we are having, and I must say that it is as good as any other Fridays that we've had, and thoughts that are getting disseminated and discussed is very useful. So about the challenges in attracting finance to the SOE sector, I think is broadly the question. Now I have 2-3 points which I'll quickly run through given the time constraint. The governance in state-owned enterprises is one of the critical aspects that the private sector, and generally the perception of the public, is that it's been undermined by political needs, and that's causing concern among private sector investors to capital markets. This governance issue is as a result of the appointments that the government and the politicians make, and the influence that they may have on the board of directors to management to achieve the ends of a political agenda can clearly undermine the commercial realities of an institution. This will run across performance management, people's issues, professionalizing the management, and all those aspects get undermined as a result of, if you don't have a proper governance, meeting with government standards and norms that are expected by financiers and investors and people who provide funds. Now, related to that is actually putting in place a performance management culture and a system for the SOEs to actually start performing and being accountable and responsible for the objectives and the KPIs they're supposed to achieve. So I believe that's very fundamental, and that's the one I think if we can nail, and accountants have a very big role to play in that process. I have heard numerous times the question, there are so many accountants in the SOEs, why can't they actually contribute to what is expected to happen? Now, another problem you might have in SOEs actually is not having the enabling environment for performance, having the necessary systems, processes in place for accountants or for that matter any other professionals to perform. And these system processes requires restructuring reforms, and the culture that prevails in SOEs invariably doesn't allow that to happen. Unions to political aspirations doesn't actually is not a catalyst, so it's a limitation for some of these reforms. So creating the right enabling environment and putting governance in place will definitely make a big impact on SOAs. I can tell you there are enough funds, as we heard from the previous speeches, there are enough private sector parties who will wish to tie up or who will try to go do PPPs. Unfortunately, why there are limitations is as a result of some of these critical issues. Thank you.
Mr. Ishak.
Thank you, Yolanda. So I'll be restricting to few bullet points because of paucity of time. I'll be restricting to few bullet points as major challenges to attract the investment. They could be, in my opinion, the weak and myopic regulatory paradigm, political meddling of the governments, and in my opinion, these two are mainly responsible for the current plight of service delivery. In addition to these, because the political adjustment, if not the political meddling or the political interference, that breaks the consistency of the policies of the government, including the tax regime. So that shakes the trust level of the investor because non-consistent policies. And other reason could be that non-identification of the projects with a view of socially optimal projects and commercially viable projects. And I'll be giving 2-3 examples of such projects. And non-identification of projects through public benefit tests. So wherever this has been taken care of, we have success stories, especially in Sindh, regarding primary health initiative, infrastructure projects, projects in energy sector. Wherever there are little consistency in the policies and the regimes are consistent and the policies are in place directly in synchronization to the degree of these 2-3 things, the success stories are there. So we have to have the consistencies, and especially I'll be mentioning that now the federating units, meaning by the provinces and the federal, after 18th Amendment in Constitution of Pakistan, so there are minimum 2 layers of regulatory paradigm, provinces and the federal. So there has to have some consistency to solidify or attract the investor by building the confidence in consistency and the paradigms. Thank you.
Yes, please go ahead, Mr. Kwok.
So, good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be here to share our experience, how to face it and how to cope with the private sector capital. You see that the title forum today is the finance reform for economic development. Of course, the chance here for the economic development is belong and become to the private sector. The reason, the question, why is that? You see that Vietnam now is facing two challenges to attract private sector investment. You see that because I'm working in the power sector, that we need a lot of money to invest every year. For example, for more than 2 decades, Vietnam have a great double digits electric consumption growth rate. It means that every year we need from 5 to 6 billion US dollar to invest in the power sector. The first challenge is facing with the private sector is that in the local private sector, it's shortage of capital. You see that in each our power project need at least nearly and roughly 1 billion US dollar for one power project. And one project can be last from 5 to 7 years to put into operation for example, power project. And the second is that the facing and challenging for the international strategic investor. We have a lot of discussion and help from the World Bank Group, from the international financial institution, and we have to discuss a lot of potential investor. But the challenge here is that the investor needs the long-term government guarantee for their investment. The reason is that when the private sector just only want to participate in the profitable sector, meanwhile in Vietnam, say for example, for power sector project need long-term and profit and dividend they expected to get from there is not much as in comparison with another sector. So, is there any opportunities for the private sector in Vietnam to participate in power sector? In our experience, they will have two opportunities. The first one that we think they can participate in investment in new projects. For example, new power plants and new distribution asset. And second is that maybe we are familiar with it's the M&A, privatization process that the private sector will have opportunities to investment in. Even we have so there are opportunities to participate in the first case, it means new project, but so far it's not much improvement. The figure here I want to show you that now Vietnam have 45,000 megawatt installed generation capacity. Meanwhile, SOE, including EVN, Vietnam Electricity, Petro Vietnam, Vinacom are accounting for 75%. It means that 25% remaining belong to the BOT, belong to the private sector, belong to the IPP. It's not much. And the second way we do is that we have to IPO. Just Ms. Orlando have requested us to answer. You know that in the early of this year, EVN, I have responsible to offer and to launch the big IPO for our Generation Corporation. Even previously, we have offered a lot of IPO, but have success. But this case is not success yet because, in my opinion, there are some reasons. The first that our Generation Corporation with nearly 1 billion charter capital, very big amount of money. The second is that when international strategic investors want to come in, they have short times to make a due diligence. In that big capital, big deal need raise a long time. And the third is that there is a concern about the international trust investors that they want to have foreign hard currency conversion to draw back the money after, say, for example, 25 years for thermal power plant or 40 years for the hydropower. And I think that we have the still to cope with, and we have to resolve this problem with some change in the legal framework of Vietnam. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kwan. Motam?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me on the panel. I think the private sector, we've looked at the presentations in the earlier sessions, and everyone realizes the fact that SOEs or the state governments do not have the finances to create the infrastructure that is required. Private sector money has to be deployed to fulfill that gap in infrastructure investment. And I think what we as financiers in the private sector are looking for are consistency in policy. The prime example in Pakistan might not be, it's a sensitive area, is power generation, power distribution. But when we look at the history of power generation in Pakistan, we look at the early 90s when the IPP structure was set up, where the private sector was engaged to bring in and fulfill that power infrastructure gap. What we realized was the policies were very robust, very good policies, and the private sector was very engaged in putting these projects in, and then hence were able to raise the finances for these projects. And that policy was then stopped, and then it went into a political quagmire. And then we go along the way when the power sector gap, power generation gap, again, the deficit increased significantly. The IPPs or the private sector was again engaged in this whole process. And yes, the policies came in, the private sector came in with high returns. But then that policy again stopped, whether it be the tariff issue, whether it be any other policy issue. And I think that inconsistency is where the private sector or their financiers or the banks or the financial the institutions realize that we are putting in all this effort, all this work is being put in there, but with no results. And I think if the consistency or a holistic policy can be designed and created, that will ensure, that will give a complete roadmap to the private sector or to the financiers, how to fulfill the gap that is required in the infrastructure. And I think the critical part, and a number of people have mentioned it this morning also, that the consistency of policy is something very important. Yesterday, the chairman of, the secretary of OICC mentioned, you can have a tax of 40%, 50%, but let us know, people will come in. So when you change it on an ad hoc basis, that's where private sector or the private sector financing gets into trouble. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Masam, and the rest of the members of the panel. You have put on the table a number of very important key challenges, right, that need to be tackled in order to maximize the impact of the private sector on economic development in the developing world. You have raised a number of issues, right, related to private sector, like, for instance, the need for consistency of application of the policy, the need to have trust in government, the need for facing and resolving issues of integrity and transparency. So let us now delve deeper into some of these topics, and let's look at some of the tools and strategies that you have used to address those challenges and your particular situation in each of your countries. So let's start with Muniz on K Electric. K Electric has made a clear financial turnaround since 2008, 2009, Before that, it was a loss-making entity. So please elaborate about some of the challenges that you face executing this turnaround and highlight for us the public policies that supported that process. How can greater private sector investment be encouraged in the energy sector, in the energy industry? And what are the ancillary benefits that you have identified on privatization?
Thank you very much, Linda, for mentioning case successful turnaround from 2008 to till now. Let me tell you that when this new management took over K Electric in 2008-2009, the entity was having negative EBITDA of $87 million. We had 18,500 headcount, out of which 1,500 were management and 17,000 were non-management. It's a fact that we had some 652 gardeners and 358 approximately engineers in 2008, while this company is all around electricity, power generation, transmission and distribution. So the challenges at that point in time is to fix the processes, the development of the human capital, arranging of the financing, and turning around. There's obviously all these issues we were able to resolve through, although we have 25% shares of Government of Pakistan, but there's absolute control of the current management in terms of taking decisions. We fixed the processes. We fixed the headcount. Today we are 11,000 headcount company with 5,500 management and 5,500 non-management. So we have gone a long way in terms of fixing that. The system was dilapidated. There were outages, long outages, unannounced. T&D losses were as high as 37%. Today, our T&D losses are less than 20%. We have the fleet efficiency improving from 30% in 2007-2008 to 40% now. We have the state best available power generation systems here. We have invested $2 billion in the system all across Karachi, which helped K Electric to improve from $87 million of negative EBITDA to $44 million of positive EBITDA in the last publicly available financial statements. What helped us actually is a tariff which incentivized K Electric to retain the efficiencies that we bring into the system. By adding that power generation, which was very efficient, by reducing T&D losses, the resultant ROI was allowed to be retained, and which helped us to improve from that level to where we are right now. Obviously, there's still issues with the circular debt, which is the most talked about discussion in the country. Although, you know, we are handling that issue through some synthetic hedge when we buy power from the national grid. So in what actually it can do, how you can attract investment in power sector is as alluded by Mozam. You know, you have to have consistency in your policies. You have to give good tariff. I would not say high returns, but when we have talked about investors taking risk of not able to turn around the company or the entity, you have to give them a longish runway with known policies, you know, which will be around those entities. The regulators, they have to ensure that they are taking care of the interest of the consumer as well as the investors. It is very important. In Pakistan, when you make money, it is assumed as a crime. It should not be so. You have to understand in terms of the returns that entity is making with the risks they are taking. So it is very important. And again, you know what, ultimately it will help in the overall context of things is that if you can privatize the distribution companies which are being owned and run by the government right now, it will reduce the burden on the government to finance to the extent of the losses that are incurred in those distribution companies, which are a cause of concern when you have to fund that amount from the fiscal space that you have. So I think we cannot be asking the governments to distribute electricity bills, meet readers, and then collect those monies and ensure that people do not steal and in the investment infrastructure. You have to give the tariffs that will attract those investments. You have to give long-term perspective to those so that people can come, and there are low-hanging fruits, we have no doubt about that, which can be reaped very quickly if these things can be applied.
Thank you, Muniz. Let us now hear from Mr. Arjuna, and the topic with you would be the International Financial Reporting Standards. So they are set at standards issued by the International Accounting Standards Board, and they are supposed to make companies' accounts understandable, more comprehensible across boundaries in countries, right? Across international boundaries. Given the potential of the IFRS to reduce barriers and impediments to strong partnerships between SOEs and the private sector, can you tell us about the impact of IFRS on attracting private sector capital in your own experience?
Sure. So, application of IFRS for state-owned enterprises. So, if a state-owned enterprise, by definition, is normally a commercial enterprise, it is must that SOEs adopt the accounting standards, commercial accounting standards, which is IFRS, or the standards that the country adopts. Now, the problem and the challenges sometimes that SOEs face is that if it's enterprise in the private sector, it's mandatory that they account as per the accounting standards or the IFRS. But when a state-owned enterprise is formed under a specific act, there is no mandatory requirement for adoption of IFRS. But I think there are many commercial enterprises on a voluntary basis adopts IFRS in order to go to markets and mobilize funding. And if you have adopted IFRS in full, you can be guaranteed, and your results are reasonable, you can be guaranteed that actually mobilizing funds will be at a reasonable cost. And if not, you have this risk of not being able to mobilize because your accounting treatment to your financial statements are not a set of financial statements that you can rely upon. It can be costly in mobilizing funds. That's one thing. Obtaining a rating is an issue. For all these reasons, you run the risk of not being able to mobilize funds for state-owned enterprises if you're not adopting international accounting standards or IFRS. Now, IFRS, once you adopt them, even if the company or state-owned enterprise is not doing reasonably well because, let's say, because of social obligations, I can tell you still the public and the investors will attribute a certain amount of credibility to the institution and the financial statements, and actually will be, and they will be able to mobilize funding. So it's very, very critical that actually the SOE starts applying themselves in adopting IFRS. Now, one of the aspects that possibly to adopt IFRS, the requirements for SOEs, is to build capacity in-house. IFRS is not easy, it's changing very fast. And the other thing is to actually have a governance framework that enforces the IFRS. Once you have this in place, and I'm quite sure that will give the necessary capacity for them to mobilize funds at cost-effective rates. Another thought is that the social obligation that sometimes SOEs have is a deterrent to actually adopt IFRS. I don't believe so. IFRS is financial statements that actually will is adaptable in any context. And if you want to attribute value to the social aspects that the ISOEs are actually involved in terms of meeting community objectives to national objectives, the integrated reporting concepts that we have heard, which actually talks about the intangibles, will actually can be discussed in the annual report of the integrated reporting, which in fact will supplement the financial statements that are prepared through IFRS. So I think it's critical. The benefits of it is that, and also you can be comparable. You can be a monopoly, SOE can be a monopoly, or maybe competing with other commercial enterprises. So for comparison purposes, it is very important that actually you portray your financial statements that are comparable. You will be able to do your working capital calculations properly, you will be able to do your costing properly, you'll be able to do your pricing properly, which all attributes for increasing commercial viability of SOEs. Yes, thank you.
Excellent reasons for starting operating by the IFRS. Mr. Icap, the next question is for you. It is widely acknowledged that fostering the establishment of PPPs requires a certain level of flexibility. Question is about flexibility in procurement, in auditing, and other stages that is not customary in investments that are financed by the public sector, fully financed by the public sector. We experience this issue day in and day out at the World Bank when we get involved in the financing of PPPs and the procurement of PPPs. So while a rules-based approach has been critical to ensuring accountability in the public sector for projects financed by the public sector, how can oversight agencies reconcile these needs of flexibility vis-a-vis the case of PPPs so that you maximize value for money, right? And with existing rule-based approaches and compliance practices.
Thank you, Yolanda. Quite a bit detailed question, but only 3 minutes you had given. So first of all, for the sake of audience, let me highlight this again, that the Office of Original, my office is the primary accountability office in the country. Okay, that PPPs require flexibility, not only in, basically in procurement, but auditing and other stages as well. So the big question is that how the oversight agencies reconcile themselves. When I say oversight agencies, so Auditor General's Office works on behalf of parliamentary oversight. We are answerable to the Parliament and we are bound to give a true and fair reflection of the accounts of these public entities. So the big question is this, that how far these oversight agencies can reconcile with the needs of flexibility, basically in procurement. And this is the area, as you were mentioning in the start of the session, the corruption. So I'm just flagging one word, corruption, without talking on or deliberating on that. So the biggest question my department or the departments responsible for oversight, and we being for parliamentary oversight. So the biggest question for me is how far we can reconcile with this requirement of flexibility, considering that one word which I flagged. So the government of Pakistan traditionally is a policy giver, historically performing three functions of policies, regulator, and service provider. And there are very good examples that the regulating regime has developed itself excellently and Few examples could be the State Bank of Pakistan, NAPRA, and AGRA. But the basic question that is there, that how far I can accommodate. Okay, the the rules have to be streamlined, and the rules not may be up to the limit that the investment is blocked or the investor is frightened. But the basic question I raise is that the role of oversight bodies have not significantly been flagged, and they are taken as the road blocker towards the investment. So we have to find this question that is the oversight a road blocker? The rules are road blocker? Or how far they can be accommodated in, or we can be flexible, especially in procurement. And procurement is, is the big arena. So, and in this regulated regime, the public institutions could not be developed, and the only outcome is compromising the service delivery to the public. And when I'm saying compromised, and when I'm flexible up to the limit in procurement, so the public money is also compromised in the shape of corruption, or minimum, if I may dilute, the project deliverables are not achieved in time. Okay, the other aspect is there, that the oversight may cause the overrun, the time and the cost both, and again having a direct bearing on the deliverables of the project or the service delivery to the public. So basically it has to have a dialogue, and a dialogue to streamline the regime. And again I'll be referring what I was referring to, that there shall be, I'm using the word shall, there shall be one tier of regulation. Let it be at federal level, let it be at federating unit or provincial or administrative levels. I'm referring to Gilgit, Baltistan, Azad Kashmir, and the 4 provinces. So there may be one tier, okay, adjustment or cushion may be there, and the Office of the Auditor General, may I share this, that I used to certify the foreign aided projects in Pakistan, including the World Bank, 20 plus projects, and respectable development partners. So the big question, what I used to face while drafting the management letter of those 225 or 222 projects was this, that how far I could be flexible. Because this is the development partners or the lenders board who is going to decide on the basis of my letter. So this is the big question I used to face, and we have to have a dialogue. We have to have one tier setup of regulations, and up to the level that, and my office, the projects, ongoing projects, upcoming projects, they prove that we are flexible already. We are much flexible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rishad. It is indeed a difficult balance to reach, given the fact that as we said, the OECD study is pointing out to the high levels of corruption within SOEs. Let's turn to our colleague from Vietnam, Mr. Quang. Vietnam has been making a significant effort to facilitate initial public offerings in SOEs, for SOEs. What has your experience been taking such an influential company through this IPO process? What were the major challenges, and what are the lessons learned that you can share with the audience?
Yes, as you know that Vietnam now have to do very serious economic restructuring, especially to divestment and privatize big SOE. That's why in my case, I saw the unsuccessful case of IPO now. Previously, all the privatization are taken place for the individual power plant or for small-scale state-owned enterprise, and they all success. And of course, at that case, all private sector can participate not only in the capital injection, but also participate in the management and dominate the company. But right now, when Vietnamese government decided to do privatization with the big company, for example, from this early year, Vietnam have launched 4 to 5 IPO to privatize big state-owned enterprise. For example, in Vietnam, we do IPO for EVN Genco 3. With this case, we offer 36% of charitable capital for strategic investor from international and foreign country. In this case, we call for some investor from Qatar, from South Korea, from Thailand, and from India also. But the difficulty here is that they have to face with very limited times to discuss and to make due diligence. For example, in our legal framework, they have only 4 months to do due diligence and to decide whether they take part in the strategic investor. The second is that IPO here, when we do big state-owned enterprise, it means that those corporations are scatter their business performance not only in the place of one province, but they scatter all around the country. For example, our Genco 3 are accounting for 16% of installed generation capacity in the country, and they own 6 or 7 power plants all over the country. With that huge capital transaction, the private investors are not attracted with this deal. The reason is that we call for only and mobilize only less than 1% of total capital for this deal. And we also look back what happened to that IPO and how we can propose and to rechange our idea, our approach to do. The first one we propose to the government is that we have to change our view. For example, we divide the corporation, not only the whole parent company, but also we privatize each power plant. The second is that when we attract strategic investor from outside, they need a high rate of dividend. For example, when we have more than 30 joint stock company in the power generation, we request 10 to 15% dividend per year. Meanwhile, Genco 3 corporation get only 3 to 5% profit. The reason is that big SOE and utility have to bear the burden of social responsibility. That's why the profit is less than the private one. And the third is that we have to decide to transfer it into from SOE to the stock company, even we sell out only less than 1%. And we hope that when our proposal to the government to divide it, the scale of IPO and to have a good PPA, power purchase agreement like the KLT so, we hope that the IPO will be better at the later period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hua. The question now, it's the last question, and I have been advised that we are running out of time, so sorry, Moasam, but let's try to be quick. See, Pakistan provinces have been given more autonomy and authority to undertake PPPs. and engage the private sector to finance development projects. So what lessons can city and local governments learn from Pakistan's experience at the provincial level in making projects, particularly in sectors like water, sanitation, road construction, bankable and attractive to the private sector?
Thank you, Yolanda. This was something that Dr. Shamshad also mentioned in her speech, that now you have public-private partnership laws passed by the federal government and subsequently after the 18th Amendment by the provincial governments. So now when investors are looking at projects or they are trying to investigate projects, they are looking at 2 or 3 different laws that are being implemented in the country. And that creates that challenge on trying to figure out how do we want to approach it. If it is, some PPP units in provinces are under the finance ministries, some are under the planning and development ministries. So that creates a confusion among the investors. What we've seen is some small PPP structures being set up, whether it be healthcare, whether it be education, whether it be a few road networks, but there's no framework that's there. There's no monitoring system that's there. So, you've given out a healthcare unit out on a public-private partnership structure. Who is monitoring it? How many patients are being managed out there? What is the protocol? What are the benchmarks? These are not being clearly articulated, whether it through a framework, whether through monitoring exercises. So I think that challenge has to be overcome because these are small projects. When we go into complex, large projects, as Yolanda mentioned, when we talk about water, when we talk about waste management, these large, complex projects are 10 years, 15-year projects. And when provincial governments don't have the capacity, don't have the financial strength to cater to these public-private partnership projects, that thought process has to go through where the provinces and the federal government needs to work together and try to figure out what framework do they need to come up. And I think that's very important that we address this challenge. We try to figure out what is the monitoring mechanism, what are the benchmarks. It can't be a benchmark that is different for the province of Sindh compared to the province of Punjab or KPK or Balochistan. I think those universal benchmarks need to be created. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohsen. So with that, we have come up to the end of this first panel discussion. Unfortunately, because of the fact that we're running late, there will be no time for questions and answers. You can send your questions and we will provide them to each of the members of the panel, and throughout the day, when there is a chance, you will get the response. But at this moment, I have been asked to finish the session. I would like there are many lessons that we have learned from listening to the panel members. But I think 3 that come to mind is the fact that there is a need for having a policy framework that can be applied consistently. That's a huge priority. It is also critical, from what I hear, to have a regulatory framework, one set of rules that is clearly applied and that can allow the monitoring of the performance of the PPPs. And third, last but not least, is the fact that the process of privatization, regardless of the percentage of ownership that is being sold to the private sector, can be a very painful one. As mentioned by Muniz, they had to make difficult decisions when it came to rationalization of staffing. So that alone is it's a difficult measure. And we understand that among that, there were other measures that were taken because at the end of the day, they need to reassure the private sector investor that there will be a profit at the end of the day. So thank you very much to all the members of the panel. I think it's been a very exciting discussion, and we have all learned a lot from your own experiences. Thank you to the audience.